killer sperm, blue and humpback. These are some of the whales of Galway Bay. Come see these beautiful, intelligent creatures hire Pigoggy Webster for all of their academic projects. That thing they do with the tail, that's them dancing in happiness at another successful project by Pigoggy Webster. You're not going to need a bigger budget. You're going to need PigoggyWebster.com.
And I think we have to start because time is precious. And so we have two lovely women and me presenting their work today. We'll start with Helen Crump, who is a good friend of mine, a lovely, lovely human being. And her presentation is about her interpretation of open practices, and her title is Enacting the Value of Openness by Sharing. I'll leave you with her, and then I'll introduce the next speaker, who is me. And so you have everything. There's your clicker if you need it, and okay. Here it is, if you need it. Thank you. I'll check the time for you, don't I?
Okay, yeah, I know.
So I shall tell you, wait, let me put the clock. Just a 20, I put 15, okay? So I can tell you when you have 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, so, yeah, but I say 15 and then you know, yeah? So ready?
Okay. Yeah. Hi, my name is Helen Crump. I'm a PhD research student at the Open University in the UK, and my research is into open educational practices within the context of networked participatory scholarship. In this presentation, I'll outline how I conceptualize openness and how I utilize the idea of self-OER that Suzanne Kosioglu and Maha Bali proposed at OER 16, and how I used it as an interview prompt for discussion about open practices and the relationship with open educational resources. I'll then go on to outline how my analysis and interpretation is progressing, highlighting the role of sharing and little OERs in open practices, before going on to consider how value is created and the nature of labour that this involves. Coining the term self-OER, Kosioglu and Bali proposed that understanding of open educational resources should be widened from one that primarily regards open educational resources as openly licensed content to include individuals in the learning community. That is, to see individuals or their practice as an open educational resource. They contend that an individual or the self and their practice can become an open educational resource by the process and products of open scholarship. Essentially, this is the connections or relationships that are formed and the resources that are produced. Within this, they also contend that many individuals hold openness as a worldview or are open as a way of being. The idea of openness as a way of being really resonated with me. What's more, I was certain that it would resonate with others, so I used the idea of self-OER to facilitate interviews with 11 participants. Relative to their own practice, participants were asked to comment on the particular framing of openness and the depiction of practice within the idea of self-OER, and to present a selection of texts or resources that exemplified their openness. This show-and-tell method proved a very useful way to surface aspects of practice, particularly the meanings that participants attribute to it and the relationship between practice and resources. And yes, the concept of self-OER resonated. All 11 participants, for a whole host of different reasons, said openness as a worldview or as a way of being was how they framed their practice. And for many, openness directly equates to sharing. Participants said openness for them was sharing. It was a human element. It was identity. It was being open to others. It's about life and it's about freedom. Before I move on, I have to say that I was really challenged in the early stages of my research with questions like, how does the self become an open educational resource, and how might practice be seen as a resource? And also the nature between discourse and materiality, which came out of my MRes study. So to resolve this, I adopted Karen Barad's idea of a phenomenon, which derives from quantum physics. Instead of focusing on separate entities or agencies with inherent boundaries and properties, it means that openness is seen as a phenomenon in which there are no predetermined boundaries between the individual self, the resources produced, and the technology. Consequently, openness in my study is regarded as a single phenomenon. It's a process or a doing, and it's enacted in practice. And my study is an interpretive case study which essentially seeks to describe openness and its distributed nature. At this point, I need to highlight the sorts of texts and resources that participants presented as exemplifying their openness and that they shared in practice. Valenciano and Kimmons regard open or networked participatory scholarship as referring to teaching and research practices that espouse openness, and this takes three forms: open access publishing, open education, including OER and open teaching, and networked participation. Participants referred to all these forms of scholarships, and the texts or resources they presented covered this spectrum. But what was most noticeable was that everyone, to a greater or lesser extent, positioned their openness in relation to networked participation. This was either exemplified by their blog, their Twitter, an online community they belonged to, or a combination of similar things, Flickr and Instagram even. It seems that the aspect of social media and networked participation adds a certain vibrancy to openness. That is, it adds the human element. I was really struck by just how much meaning, purpose, desire, care and support that was on display. Honestly, there was just so much life and so much humanity. As such, right, you got it, there's humanity, right. As such, the majority of texts or resources presented were not typical OERs. They were what Martin Weller refers to as little OER, individually produced, low-cost resources that don't have explicit educational aims or learning outcomes. Consequently, their use can be unpredictable in unpredicted contexts. So broadening the definition of OER to include little OER means that we can now consider a continuum of resources. But this begs the question, how little can a little OER be, and what exactly is viable as an OER? Back in 2006, Stephen Downes asked whether people could be considered open educational resources. And since then, a number of people have asserted that yes, they can. Okay, so when researching a phenomenon, Scott and Orlikowski ask, what does the phenomenon depend on? What drives practice? Well, overwhelmingly, and no surprise, openness is enabled by sharing. Kennedy points out that although sharing is a central concept of networked culture, its conceptual boundaries with other social theories of exchange haven't been established, nor has the concept been adequately critiqued. and moreover, there are few empirical studies on how sharing is practiced when mediated by social media. Added to this, the notion of sharing presents many possible meanings. It relates to the distribution or division of physical resources, as well as to the sharing of an experience or disclosure of personal information. Goods shared can be material or immaterial, and immaterial goods are intellectual or affective. Consequently, sharing has both social and economic dimensions, which are counterpoised in network culture. That's a condition in which opposing forces are equal to one another and have balancing or contrasting effects. Typically, sharing in network culture is explained in relation to gift giving and its feature of reciprocity. Across the board, in some way or another, participants in my study equated openness with reciprocity. Explaining sharing in terms of gift giving and reciprocity distinguishes it from commodity exchange. But you know what? It turns out there's no discrete theory of sharing. Following the work of Marcel Mauss in 1954, sharing has conventionally been explained as a subcategory of gift exchange theory. However, anthropologists such as Whitlock, who mainly study hunter-gatherer societies, have a host of empirical evidence that refutes sharing as being reciprocal. Gift giving involves giving, receiving, and reciprocating, and as such it's a two-way exchange between two people. It's about establishing and strengthening social bonds, as in kinship relations. But sharing, on the other hand, is not reciprocal, because although you receive something through sharing, you're not obligated to give something back to the same person. Sharing, then, is a one-way transfer that's multi-directional. It's not about strengthening social bonds per se, it's about enabling, indeed maximising, access opportunities all round. It's an economic mode of transfer that enables others to access what's needed or is of intrinsic value. Sharing provides an alternative to both gift exchange and market exchange. And what's more, sharing is not initiated by the giver. Rather, it's prompted by the receiver in the form of a demand. This demand is on the basis of individuals, humans, sharing needs derived from the fact that they share the experience of life itself and that they recognise this as such. So this demand can be spoken or silent. The silent demand is founded on bodily presence. In the context of human sociality, bodily presence by itself constitutes a demand for being acknowledged as a human being with legitimate needs. For example, in anthropology, it's frequently observed that a person who silently positions themselves next to a fire or a cooking pot will most likely be given something by the person tending to it. And online, bodily presence equates to embodied presence and the invisible other or the lurker. Sharing practices are established, as I've said, through bodily co-presence. And Kate mentioned co-presence earlier. But they also involve communication or speech acts to structure the process. Plus, they also depend on the relationship or affordance of the thing being shared, as well as being influenced by the nature or materiality of the physical space involved. So the internet, then, is fundamentally a sharing technology. Its surveilling properties enable us to imagine the watching presence of others. Its infrastructure facilitates efficient resource sharing, and the addition of social media enables a social dimension of communication. The upshot is that the internet enables both the sharing out of resources and the sharing in of life's experiences. Seen like this, and in contrast to gift giving, sharing is about creating opportunities and gaining access to what's needed or valued. It's not a matter of obligation and the imperative to reciprocate. Rather, it's about the opportunity to request, which means the initiative is with the potential recipient. It enables them to request what they need, things that are not already out there or not easily located. Sharing is a way to achieve one's needs or reach one's goals through the help of others. It's the recognition that fellow human beings can provide what's needed, and it's the power that's asserted based on the recognition that we share life and we understand what others require. Oops, have I got the wrong thing? Oops, sorry, right, missed the slide. So, given this understanding of sharing in relation to openness, we can see that when Pearl in my study says, I ask for help, that we're not talking about gift giving because people don't generally ask to be given gifts. She's demanding access to what she needs. Pearl was struggling with an aspect of her research, so in order to get help, she set up a Facebook group to get the help she needed. Now others can join the Facebook group and similarly ask for help. Then there's the silent demand from the invisible imagined other. It was noticeable just how many participants were conscious of having an audience and the possibility that there were people out there with unfulfilled needs or who'd find something that they had to be of value. They hoped their posts, their comments or their resources would be useful to others. It was also noticeable just how much the texts or resources presented exhibited personal or social aspects, that is, affective goods. There was such a lot of lived experience on display, relating to both professional and personal life. Jeff narrates his course design decisions. Sheila blogs about her struggles with openness. Rebecca shared her breast cancer story and now researches in this area. And Laura openly documents or narrates aspects of her professional life and personal practice. As we can now appreciate, sharing is about opportunity, the opportunity to request access to things we need or solicit opportunities for ourselves. Laura puts her finger on it when she says the interrelated practice of sharing and openness is partially controlled and partially serendipitous. Either way, it's about creating opportunities for yourself. She gives the example of provoking a discussion on Twitter by making a deliberately controversial statement. The exchange resulted in her being asked to contribute to a podcast. Maybe I should click this in more often. Right. People participate in communities and networks because there's value in it. People who don't get value, they won't participate. In the first instance, value is derived in the immediate term from the experience of participation itself. This can simply be through connecting with others, asking a question and passing on information or providing feedback, or just being with others who understand your challenges. On the other hand, value in the form of knowledge capital is something that can be realized later, and this can take a number of forms. Participating in communities and networks helps develop an individual's skills and competencies. That is, it helps develop their human capital. Social relations and connections are also a form of knowledge capital, and the cultivation of one's reputation is a social achievement that can also operate as a knowledge resource. Undoubtedly, open practices contributes to a reputational economy. Amongst the participants, there was no shortage of benefits derived from cultivating one's reputation. Invitations to speak at conferences, for example. Reputation translates into a form of value, as does, Reputation translates into a form of value exchange, as does human capital. Okay. However, it's the role of use value that intrigues me in all of this, and commodification. It seems that open sharing practices are built around the concept of use value, and that this helps foster the way in which value is created. Scholars such as Benkler and Bowens argue that the peer-to-peer sharing economy is founded on the promise of use value over exchange value and the partnership between the peer-to-peer economy and the market. However, I'm not sure how this works exactly, because we've already acknowledged that once something like a little OER is out there, its use is unpredictable in unpredicted context, so it could easily become a commodity. As Kennedy points out, the exchange of information, data, and immaterial labour that constitute open sharing practices gets transformed into a commodity to be exchanged. As Audrey Waters has highlighted, the aspect of value and the invisibility of labour in open practices. The relationship of openness to the labour market and the precarity of higher education was a noticeable feature in my study. 5 out of 11 participants related to it in one way or another. Maeve and Libby acknowledged that they could see the benefits of sharing and open practices in order to secure employment in precarious circumstances. And Gabby said she was appreciative of the identity and support that open scholarship afforded her when she was in between institutions. It's important to analyse what's not included in material discursive practices. What's excluded matters because it remains in play as a constitutive element. And guess what's not included in the discourse of open? Labour. Overwhelmingly, the emphasis is on the product, not the producer. Labour is downplayed and labelled as creativity, and possibly, and care. Care's in there as well. Forgot that one. Considering that networked participatory scholarship requires the construction and performance of identities which are essentially established through a range of strategies involving some aspect of our life or our bios, I'm drawn to Foucault's idea of biopower, a disciplinary form of power over life, and how this seems to have been appropriated into the workplace for productive purposes. Moreover, how sharing seems to feed into this, considering that we're practically compelled to share as we recognise the needs of others. So, under the term biocracy, Fleming highlights how productivity is increasingly dependent on personal aspects of human life for its value-creating qualities. Much of this tacit dimension can't be sourced or nurtured inside the institution. It's not just a matter of formal learning and explicit codified knowledge anymore. Value is increasingly derived from aspects of tacit knowledge that's learnt socially or informally. Moreover, it's generally developed beyond the formal remuneration process, and as such, it takes on the form of free work. Free work, or free labour, in the Biocratic Academy harnesses our free time. Oh, and our self-organisation and our capacity for self-development. So why does this matter? What's at stake? Because it represents the enclosure of social value. It's the social commons that's at stake. It's the onslaught of the social factory. After transcribing participant interviews, I wrote in my notes the word total capture, and I've been trying to understand what this means ever since. Enclosing social value and the capture of the social commons forms the basis of neoliberal human capital theory. That is, we're no longer just participants in an economic exchange relationship, rather we're the living embodiment of capital. Sharing practices capture value production from forms of socialization founded on a communistic nature. Utilizing our bios, the diffusion of sharing practices promotes a systemic integration of ephemeral forms of sociality into value creation chains. Consequently, scholars are beginning to see sharing as the indication of a broader process that re-socializes economic exchange. That is, market exchange or commodification is becoming increasingly embedded in society in new and antagonizing ways. Okay, so yes, life is sharing, okay? But to what extent is life capital? That is the question. And to what extent is the self an open educational resource, or simply a human resource? As Maeve concludes in my study, ultimately, I am the resource. I hope I've explained my research clearly and my concerns. Oh, and apologies that I read it and rambled. Thank you.
Perfect timing.
Oh,
thank you, Helen.
Thank you.
Is there any question? No, you don't want questions. It's a very dense work, very theoretical and very incredibly well written. Okay, no questions then? Yes, Helen, I'm sorry, you have one.
You make a distinction between sharing and gift giving. And by that distinction, you can pull apart. But I think maybe sharing is intimately bound up with notions of fairness and justice. I'll give you an example. I had an email the other day from somebody who was struggling with something they wanted to understand. And so I devoted a couple of hours of my time to this person because I believed they were acting reasonably. But sometimes people come to me with a question, and I know they haven't really tried to answer it. They just see me as a shortcut. So that seems unfair.
So if I am an open educational resource, I exercise a judgment on whether the person is being reasonable, fair, whether they merit my time, or whether they're just being lazy. So there seems to be a dimension here that's missing.
Correct. Because as there's three parts in my reading to giving, receiving, and reciprocating, in sharing, there's actually three parts, and it's a demand to request, but you are also not obliged to answer the request. You can, I don't know what the third R is, it's reject. Okay, you can ignore them. And then the final one is relinquishing. It's about giving things away, just giving up something. So you're right, there is actually a little bit missing there. You can actually not acquiesce to the demands, but basically, from what I'm reading, sharing is not a gift, because it's that two-way reciprocal kinship thing, and it's not about obligation. It's the emphasis is on opportunity. So that person asked you for something, didn't they? You don't do that in gift giving. You don't ask for a gift. So yes, there was a little bit missing. Thank you.
Any other question? Is that it? Great.
You now, Caroline. Thank you.
Okay, can you do me the favor, Helen? When I start to do yeah? So I'm presenting myself because I'm the chair. I'm presenting the second session. So I'll put my slides up. I'm Caroline Kuhn, and I'm a PhD student at BASPA University. I'm writing up, it's my last year. I'm a part-time student, and I'm presenting, I guess, less the process of my research, but more the theoretical aspect of it that I found out quite at a late stage of my research. I'm part of the GoGN network, and that's the Tuko Pamoja here, which is an amazing network of people that come together every year, and so I'm part of that, and I'm grateful for all what I have learned from them. So I'll start with sharing the context and the problem very quickly, my research question, and what I did as an exploratory phase, my methodology, my findings, and some preliminary conclusions. So talking about the context of my study, these deterministic views of young people being digital natives, I think, is very dangerous, particularly for universities that assume that as we don't need to do anything because they already know everything. So that was a problem for me, and that deterministic views tend to then ask the question of what works, efficiency, where can we perform faster, and I think that the problematization of the use of technology on the ground is missing under those questions, and the messy present is avoided in some sense. Deterministic views at the same time, they tend to do this black boxing around technology, so when the airplane crashes, then we look at what happened, and I think we should be looking at the very beginning of the process instead at the very end. And the potential of the technologies are very, very often missed or misunderstood by practice, and it's very different. So if a technology has a potential to do something, it doesn't mean that some student will be able to accomplish that. And I think that is really important to be aware of. And students' view of looking at students as disembodied learners is a thing that you take them out of the context, and the power relations in which they are embedded, they disappear in a way, and I think that is also dangerous. This is a bit, is part of a bigger context. It's a study that the Joint Research Center did in 2008, and they were envisioning this intensive learning society, putting open learning at the core and center of what everyone does every time and everywhere. And I was just kind of asking myself, well, that's great, but where are students in this picture? And I think, doing a lot of research, that voice was and still is unexplored. And I was very interested in that voice of students and how are they managing this kind of space where they are considered they don't need any help because they're very natives. So the literature then said, At the time I started this, because I'm a part-time student, so I started this in 2015, so at the time I started, JISC was doing the Digital Student Project, which was a very, very productive project, and these things were part of that study, and then another study done at Oxford University about students wanted to do their own blend, and they wanted to find their tools and mix and play around and tinker around, but they didn't know how those digital tools would help them to support their studies. And then in our university, I chaired a conference that was student-led, and it was about exploring the different graduate attributes, which is how the UK measures, in a way, their vision. And so digitally literate was one of them. And many students came, and basically they said that they wanted to know more about what digital literacies are, or is, if we say literacy, and they would like to be taught consequently. So they were very dissatisfied. And then in a lecture hall with 187 students, I asked them, what's digital literacies? And that's the overwhelming answer. But then very funnily, I asked, okay, those who said yes, could you please put a definition there? And it was mainly jokes. So I guess that a lot of them just didn't know at the time what digital literacy is. And I think there is this saying, name it and then tame it. And I think that is really, really important if we talk about digital literacies. Then I did, using the survey that JISC used in their digital student project, and I explored a bit which are the tools they used and how they engage with different things very quantitatively. And you can see the results here, and that was also for me quite, I thought, well, aren't they digital natives with kind of tons of properties and features and stuff? But I was really asking, I don't think that is really so. And so I decided then to stop the time and say, wait, I'm going to look at the daily entanglements of students' use of digital tools and platforms on the ground, and what was happening kind of in the space with them. So I set up two research questions. One was how, why, and to what extent do students engage with tools, open or not, but open, I'll explain why, are in brackets, and platforms, and informal and in informal settings, and how do they make sense of the environment where these engagements happen. I used at the very beginning constructive grounded theory as my methodology. I had 20 students that I interviewed. I used so I organized focus group. I used the visitor and resident approach, which is this kind of canvas where they paint. You will see in a bit how they engage and with which tools. And it's kind of a continuum that you can place yourself in each of the spaces. This is one of the maps. And she was, I think, 20 at the time, and she was saying that she felt she was the forgotten generation, that no one has done anything for her in relation with digital literacies. This is another map where we can see how the personal space is quite populated, whereas if we see the academic space, they only have, and really if you see there, the tools that are there are just these already given tools by the university. So this is the virtual learning environment that my university uses. So I was kind of looking at why is this happening and how can I look at this data? What can I do with it? How can I look at these maps? What can I say about them? So I went to Cape Town 2 years ago with GoGN, who is my extended family, I would say. And there we were, all of them, and we worked a lot and we did a lot of debating. And there I came across Cheryl Hodgkinson-William, and she introduced me into critical realism and realist social theory. And so I understood this is really what I will use to look at my data. So what it does is it has a deep ontology, a stratified ontology, which means that social reality exists out there independently of us knowing about it. So reality is more than what I can see. And so that social reality is layered, and you have an empirical level, which is this visible level that you can perceive through your senses. But then you have a real level, which is the deep level where these generative mechanisms that are within structures, they are located there. But then there is this middle level where these generative mechanisms that are in the deepest level, when they are enacted, when they are active, then they generate these events that we then see at the empirical level. And I thought that was really a good meta theory to think about my data. And so what they say basically is that the empirical gives us an avenue to the real, which is this deep level, but only when the former is guided by theory. So the goal of science is the theoretical identifications of things and their causal powers. I don't have time to get into how this is not deterministic, but I have read extensively in my PhD why this is not deterministic. Basically, because social reality is conceived as an open system that is complex and emergent, so there is nothing like determination there. And so I refined my questions, thinking about what are these social conditions that are constraining students' agency as causal powers for their open digital practices. And so when I analyzed my data, I got into the empirical level using constructive grounded theory, but I then went deeper looking at the maps, and this is a topography from a geographer, but what I did is the maps I had, I started to draw some topographic ideas on them, and thinking about what makes those arrangements of the features, in this case not mountains and river, but tools, what makes these arrangements as they are? Why are they so different? And at the real level, I started to see which are the mechanisms that are in place in my sample. And I just want to say I have a very small sample, 20 students, which I'm not intending to do any generalization here. I'm just pointing to a particular problem that I do think, and I have also done the research in my PhD, that there are different studies that are more quantitative and bigger sample that point basically to some similar findings. So here we can say things that they have said. So I'm scared, I don't understand where my stuff is. The cloud, what's the cloud? Where is my stuff there in the cloud? So kind of all expressions of things that they were felt afraid of and anxious. So what I concluded in a way is that emotions like fear, anxiety, uneasiness, overwhelming feelings tell us that this formal digital space is a space of struggle, and emotions following critical realism is a mechanism. It's real and it generates inaction or action. In this case, it is inaction what it has led. The technological infrastructures as well, they are a mechanism and they constrain because it's a new language, new rules, new roles, new problems, new threats, and that is something that one needs to take into account. And on the other hand, students have approaches to learning that are different, but basically the majority has a surface approach to learning, which doesn't allow them to dig deeper into new tools, explore, and find out how to do new things. And on the other hand, in particular, I think higher education, and Kate was really, her talk couldn't be more excellent for my own position. The institutional culture is really a difficulty. I think that technology opens up the door, so they're great, a lot of technology, but at the very end, there are no resources and no time to find out how can we embed that in our practice. So policy is missing, and the culture really, I think, doesn't allow that to happen, at least in my institution. So I think this kind of idea of a space being an empty vessel where you put your tools and stuff is misleading, and it's very dangerous, and I think one needs to be very aware of that. And instead, I think we need to think about spaces as dynamic, co-constructed, and participatory. And if we see spaces as becoming through interaction with the context, and the context being filled with people and with people that are present, but maybe people that are virtually present, we would make a better job, I think. And spaces, I consider they should be as emergent because it is an open system, and so all of that complexity comes in and they emerge through that interaction. And they are co-becoming, because becoming for me is the aim of education more than skills and anything else. So I just have been doing a lot of research in relation with the sociological understanding of space and how I have drawn from human geography and critical social theory to do an analogy with what geography and space talks about and how virtual spaces have been under-theorized or under, I think, described. I think it's under-theorized. So this quote tells us, and this is about social theory around space, that natural space becomes a social phenomenon or social space once people begin to use it, boundaries are put on it, and meanings, including ownership, which I think is key for us, are attached to it. Then the air over dirt becomes a lot or a plot, and if residential users obtain control over the bounded space, then it becomes a place. And I think that that is one of the things we, I think is a good thing to be aware of when we are creating these spaces for our students. And this is the work of Soja, Edward Soja, who really is a very dense but very good sociologist about space. And it's the same thing. We should think about space not as passive, not as this Euclidean understanding, but more filled with action and meaning. And meaning is key, in my research at least, how a space is meaningful and how that then alters how that space is enacted and how that space is then populated with the tools. And so I have been thinking now about how can we think about this further? How can we create something different? And topology, which is the strand of mathematics that thinks about properties of spaces that stay invariant. So I have thought about the topology of learning spaces and looking at which are these properties that are unaffected for open learning spaces. And these are 7 doublets, how I call them, and my work is a work that is inspired by lots of people, the GoGN, Catherine Cronin, Wendy Liu, who is a really good critical mind around technology, Audrey Ward, well, the whole open movement. And so, I think I finished. I'm not sure where I'm going next. I'm open to any question, any suggestion, any different interpretation, any different views on what I have done, and thank you very much for your time and attention. I have put, I'll put this up, and there are a lot of references for you, whoever is interested, so there are some slides on it. Any question? Fine. Shall we then, I continue chairing after presenting. So we have now our third participant. She is Claire Macavinia et al. There are lots of people in her work. She is an academic at TU Dublin, which was before DIT, right? And her title is The Openness of New Learning Spaces in Campus-Based Institution. Very nice coincidence. She's working on physical spaces and how they afford open learning practices. So I think it's great, that analogy. So I'll leave that. Do you have your, can I put your, here? Here you have the clicker, so you can, and I'll check the time for you.
Thank you, Caroline and Helen, and indeed, yeah, it's worked out beautifully that our themes are linking so well across this particular strand. So I'm here on behalf of a number of colleagues, and many of you in the room will know them. Jen Harvey is the head of our Learning, Teaching and Technology Centre in TU Dublin, and Kevin O'Rourke is our digital campus architect, which is an interesting role that comes obviously into this topic as well. And Kevin will be here tomorrow. He's not able to be here today, if you did want to talk more with him about that. But we're also collaborating with Purdue University in Indiana on this project. And our colleague there leading on the project with us is Jason Fitzsimmons. So we were inspired to look at openness around physical learning spaces in a campus-based institution, really following the keynotes and the discussion of openness at EdTech, the Irish Learning Technology Association conference back in 2018. And when we knew that O-043 was coming to Galway, it seemed like the ideal chance to begin to engage with this and think about it. But we are novices. We're hopefully legitimate peripheral participants in this community, starting to think about openness. And it's very, very timely, because not only are we constructing a new technological university, it's the first one in Ireland, we're also constructing new physical campus buildings in the city campus, and they're also engaged in that in Purdue. So we're going to think, we're thinking a little bit in this paper about open education in the context of learning space design and what a learning space is in terms of his physical space in 2019. How have learning spaces in campus-based institutions been opened up? And technology has clearly changed how we use our physical spaces. So therefore, what has the design and use of physical learning spaces, how's that changing? How's it being remediated through the evolving use of blended and online learning? And if we have more open spaces, does that mean we're going to have more open practices? And that's what we've been thinking about over the last while. A little bit of context here. As I mentioned, both our institutions are involved in the redesign of physical spaces. So in Purdue, a new active learning centre has been built, and Jason has kindly supplied these images. We haven't been able to go there just yet, in 2017. And placing that at the middle of the campus as an active learning centre was a deliberate decision, and hopefully, again, is opening up and changing the kinds of practices people are engaging with there. The building has 27 active learning classrooms, and the STEM focus in that institution obviously is very strong, and they're consolidating libraries into one location as part of this progress. So we're looking at active learning becoming very central to the mission of the university, expressed through those spaces. In Dublin, Technological University Dublin City Campus, we're constructing a new campus at Grangegorman in the west of the city. We're on multiple sites at the moment, and the longer term plan, as colleagues in Ireland will know, is to draw us all together on the one site in Grangegorman. And that's a big cultural change as well as a big physical change, because our individual sites have their own working practices and cultures established over many years, and suddenly we're going to be on one site for the first time. So we're looking specifically there at how architecture is shaping that campus, that change, how change management is happening, and in turn how our changing pedagogies and use of technologies are influencing and interacting with that. This is very much a work in progress. It's exploratory, and I really do welcome responses, questions, suggestions, critique at the end of the presentation. So what we're finding in our work so far, and looking at the literature around this in terms of architecture and education, there's very well developed research on the design of schools and classrooms for obvious reasons. That's the compulsory education sector, and clearly there's a lot of public investment in those kinds of buildings. This seems to be less well developed for higher education, so we don't see the same amount of literature and the same amount of investigation around this. There are differences too, important differences. We're more digital, we might say. In schools, digital interactions with the web and so on are more tightly controlled for obvious reasons and firewalled and so on. Whereas we're all interacting in the digital space right now, I imagine, albeit we're in a lecture theatre of this kind. And we're in the post-compulsory sector. We've got people opting in and out. We've got flexible learning. We've got lots of different patterns of interaction with the institution and the physical spaces. So the question we've been asking is how well current learning theory and innovations in teaching and learning are being reflected in the design of our physical spaces. And the drawings here perhaps reflect some of the challenges that we might have. When new spaces are commissioned, these are the kinds of drawings that can come back, showing very fixed linear spaces. And so the challenge for us is how to have discussions across the institution and with the people designing those spaces to make them more flexible and to open them up to different kinds of activities on site. I think everyone will probably have seen this picture before. It's a 14th century image of a lecture. And we use this very often in the postgraduate diploma and third level learning and teaching in TU Dublin as a provocation to get people talking early on in their workshops. They may have only been with us for a couple of weeks, and they're early career lecturers who are engaging with learning and teaching and active learning methods for the first time. And we ask them just to look at this image and to respond to it. And I'm sure you've been asked to do that yourselves at conferences and in other settings up to now. And so we see the construction of the space here as very fixed. And it's also reflective of power. We have the speaker elevated and we can see the steps up to the lectern, to the podium there. We can talk about the makeup of the class, the gender, the age range, the ethnic background of these people. But we do see that there is some collaboration and some discussion going on, even if it's not supposed to be. There are two people talking up in the back corner. There's somebody having a nap there as well. So it's not that lectures have necessarily changed all that much in some respects from this time. But the physical space perhaps hasn't changed as rapidly as we might expect with changes in our student body and in the kinds of work that we're doing. And we're also looking here at an age of information poverty, if you like. The information is held by the lecturer, by the reader, and it's not abundant. It's not available to the other people in the room, and they need to hear it from that person. In spite of the length of time that's gone by since that image would have been created, as I say, we don't necessarily see huge change in the design of some of our spaces. Now, hopefully today you're not feeling obliged to listen to the speakers, but you're free to interact online and with each other in the room, even if we're in a lecture theatre space. But often students don't feel that they can do that. And Kevin picked out this article a while back from the Irish Times talking about Irish students reporting having less contact with their lecturers than they would like. And one of them here talking about the lecturer standing and reading off the slides. I can do that at home, and this is affecting their attendance. So this is calling into question what we're doing in these spaces. What's going to make it worthwhile for students to join us on campus? What should the campus look like, and what should we be doing? So our approach to this project is collaborative, research undertaken in partnership, and currently we're at this preliminary stage of literature review and also some desk study. Purdue are ahead of us because of the active learning space that they've recently had built over there, and they have already been out to the field and done some data gathering around that space. So we're looking at that and analysing that with them, looking at the methods that they've used and how we might deploy them in Dublin, and identifying existing institutional practices and how we might influence and change those. We also have a symposium coming up, which I really wanted to highlight in the talk today. It's been funded by the National Forum here in Ireland, and it'll take place in May 2019. Like any of the Forum seminars, they're open to all participants, so you're very welcome to join us. Maybe we'll have some online dimension to that for colleagues not based here. This is going to inform our research further, and we are hoping to attract academics, students, architects and other interested parties to that symposium shortly. And then primary research beginning in Dublin in September, drawing on the approaches and methods from Purdue, case studying. We will draw on activity theory as well to look at how we model the practices around the campus. And again, just to pick up on Helen's work from citing Barad, the fact that there are no boundaries around our learners any longer, that we draw on some of that work as well. So that's where we're at in terms of planning and taking forward this work, and the outputs are intended to support the planned use of spaces in both institutions. I think Helen has articulated, and Caroline beautifully already, open and what we're talking about with openness. I just wanted to include this in terms of how we're defining open. Again, it's difficult for us to define, but thinking about the kinds of pedagogies we would like to see, how are we going to open up teaching? How can our spaces contribute to that and give more agency to learners as contributors to knowledge? And that's, again, what we're thinking about in terms of the design of spaces here. We know that spaces have been blurring for some time. VLEs are part of the mainstream since the early 2000s. We've had the previous projects around open educational resources. Here in Ireland we had NDLR, which was referenced earlier today, Joram, Merlot in the States and in North America. We have open scholarship and access in libraries, and we know that students are constantly connected. Ownership of smartphones amongst the Irish, the population of students in Ireland is estimated at over 90%. So learning's been taking place inside and outside of the classroom and the campus for a long time. And how do we exploit that further? We could argue that any space is a learning space in 2019. We can access our learning through our devices, no matter where we might happen to be, whether that's formal or informal. We have some nice examples here from Purdue, and again that would reflect the move from formal to less formal spaces, and spaces that are flexible and allow for different kinds of pedagogical approaches to be taken. So moving from perhaps our more traditional lecture settings into open spaces under stairwells and so on that were perhaps not used in days gone by, but that can be made over slightly, changed, given appropriate furniture in order to allow students to work in their groups outside of class. This is a Padlet wall from a little exercise we ran briefly again in our diploma class just as they were starting their studies this semester, and we asked them just to go out for 15 minutes and walk around the building in Ainger Street in Dublin and take pictures of what could be learning spaces. And interestingly, most of the pictures that came back weren't lecture theatres or formal tutorial rooms. So it's a little bit difficult to see on the slide here, but you can see that we have corridor spaces, we have landing areas on the middle of floors of the building, we had canteen spaces, coffee dock areas turning up. And we've run this before with our masters groups and asked them to take pictures of places where they learn when they're not on site. And we've had garden sheds, kitchen tables, spare rooms, all kinds of spaces coming back. I think evidencing that where we do our learning has clearly changed, and how we respond to that is important in the design of our new spaces. In terms of the literature, what we've seen so far is an emphasis on trying to explore cause and effect to some extent. So we see people reporting changes in the design of space contributing to some learning benefit or a benefit for teaching in terms of growing confidence amongst academics or more success with trying active learning strategies. But perhaps what we haven't seen so far in the literature is a closer look at the interaction between space, technology and the pedagogical practices. And again, if I can reference my colleagues talking about entanglement, talking about the lack of boundaries, that's the space where I think it would be useful for us to do some further research. That we see both students and staff, I would argue, as co-creators of that environment and that digital environment. So there is evidence out there in terms of the effect of space on what we're doing, and as I say, some of the work around confidence and enhanced practice amongst lecturers using active learning spaces, and we would like to build on that and look at what those interactions might be, what's the connection between the students and the technology and the learning as they're doing it, and how are educators evolving their practice around that. Can then we change practice by changing spaces? And that's the next question I suppose we're interested in here and trying to theorise around that. Rook, Choi and MacDonald have looked at learning theory and architecture and called for a much stronger connection to be made there. And again, I think that's something that we would like to look at in the course of this project as well. Perhaps drawing on activity theory, theoretic approaches as well, where we look at how tools and instruments mediate activities and mediate practices. I'm very fortunate to work with Ciarán O'Leary at TU Dublin, whose doctoral research is looking at socio-materiality and the entanglement of people and their technologies and their practices. And again, we would see links there to research the interaction between space and activities and practice. So we'd like to use that research and theorise further to inform the consultations that are going on in our institutions at present between the people teaching and learning and those designing the spaces and building the spaces indeed for teaching and learning. And there's a key role for academic developers and educational technologists here. And this morning, listening to Sheila McNeil, Bill Johnson and Keith Smith, they talked about academic development and open education being at the heart of organisational development, which is a great message that I'll be bringing home from here in terms of the development of the technological university as an entity and also the physical development of the university in the new campus. So are we going to see more open practices with changes in open spaces? And that's what we're going to look at henceforward in this work. We have previously given as many opportunities as we can for students particularly to contribute to the design of what we're doing in the institution back in our DIT days as well. And we have a new project called Co-Create, which is to design the curriculum framework for the technological university, which will involve students in participating there around designing their learning. We're looking at more opportunities for experiential learning and undergraduate research as part of that framework. And the sharing of teaching practices across teams and collaborative working and programs is something that we've seen thriving recently in our institutions. And I think many of us can say that following the Delta initiative, particularly that the National Forum has launched, which has seen awards for programme teams engaging actively in redesigning and reviewing their programmes. So we're arguing that there does need to be more flexibility in the configuration and reconfiguration of spaces to facilitate and promote these kinds of practices, but we do need to find out which approaches are most effective and to theorise further around that. So the project that we're linked to in the TU Dublin around this is titled Enabling Pedagogical Opportunities in the Design of Learning Spaces, or EPOL, which isn't exactly tripping off the tongue, but we'll try and come up with a better acronym for it. And it's a change management project involving staff and students, building on our existing practices and also looking at the effects of particular room configurations on the kinds of activities that are taking place. So what we're doing is configuring spaces in our existing campus as they might be configured in the new campus in Grangegorman, and researching with staff and students as to the effects of that over the next number of months. The worry has been that we get to Grangegorman, and if we haven't tried anything before we get there, we'll just carry on doing what we always did. So trying to use the old campus in new ways before we move. So you can see the old furniture and the old rooms on the images here, but these are some examples of room configurations that we've been looking at. And we're encouraging staff to use these spaces to think about their choices. What can they do in these spaces and what their options might be, or what their options aren't going to be in certain cases. How will that impact upon the students' learning and on their own teaching practice? So our next steps, the symposium as mentioned, please do look out for further details of that, and you're welcome to join us. We're working on a collaboratively authored paper arising from the first phase of the study, and our fieldwork then will commence later on in the year. I'd just like to say thank you all very much, and I do welcome questions, critiques, suggestions, etc. Thank you very much.
Yeah, we have questions there. Do you need the mic? I think, yeah, you need it.
Thank you, Claire. That was really interesting. One conversation I have with one of my colleagues back in Edinburgh is about when we talk about hybrid learning spaces and we talk about people learning online and learning on campus, we end up talking about the choices people have when things go wrong. Mm-hmm. And I wondered whether inside your project you were looking at not just the configuration of space and what might happen in them, but how these different spaces might then be supported as well. Mm-hmm. Because the conversation we have plays out into there's always a wider set of choices if you're an on-campus student when something goes wrong than there might be if you're an online student. And it strikes me that in some of these spaces there is the potential for a wider set of help than there perhaps might be in other spaces as well. So I wonder, and that will have attendant implications on how willing people are to do things in them. So I wondered if that was within the scope of what you're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're very lucky in the EPOL project that we have a range of stakeholders, a range of divisions of the institution are involved in that, and AV particularly have been very, very closely involved, and ICT services. So we have tried to design that in from the outset, but I absolutely agree. We had issues with our Wi-Fi a couple of years back on the city campus, and there was definitely a period of time where people weren't trying even simple quiz tools and so on in lectures, and they just were resistant to that. So it does need to be, I think the things people are saying about the Grangegorman campus is it needs water and Wi-Fi, and we'll have all heard that talked about before. It's got to work, and for everything else to match in with that. So one of the interesting things that's happened is because you're building on that scale, tendering, procurement processes and so on have been going on for years, and by the time the designs have come back, AV have reported that equipment has moved on and they've had to change lists, change orders and so on, and change suppliers to sort of get the more up-to-date equipment in. So there are all kinds of lags in the process that affect it too.
Thanks, Claire. Just to say, we're doing some really similar research at City University London as well, that you might be interested in, with some redesigned learning spaces, and then going in doing teaching observations to see how staff are using those. and kind of, you know, building up the sort of evidence of whether it is actually changing pedagogical practices as well, or whether they're just kind of going in and doing the teaching they were doing before in these new flexible spaces. So I'll be able to put you in touch with the team if you're interested.
That would be brilliant. Thank you, Jane. That would be really helpful. That's exactly what we're trying to look at.
Okay.
Any other question? Shall we call this an afternoon? Well, a half afternoon. We still have another one to go. Yeah, I think we are. Thank you very much.
Killer sperm, blue and humpback. These are some of the whales of Galway Bay. Come see these beautiful, intelligent creatures high up in Goggy Web stuff for